Before we begin, take one quick second to check whether you're subscribed to this channel, because the revelations we are about to uncover are so deep, so disruptive, and so hidden beneath centuries of interpretation that missing the next episodes would leave you completely unprepared for what is coming. Many people watch these videos, but forget to subscribe, and then they wonder why they never see the follow-ups that connect every piece of the mystery. So confirm your subscription now, activate the notifications, and then open your heart, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you were ever taught about the beginning of evil. Now imagine this. What if the serpent in the Garden of Eden was not Satan in disguise, not a fallen angel wearing reptilian skin, but a being far more complex, far more unsettling, and far more intimately connected to the perfection of Eden than anyone has dared to consider? What if the oldest deception in the world is not that the serpent tempted Eve, but that humanity misunderstood who or what was actually speaking to her? Most people never question the traditional version of the story. They accept that the serpent equals Satan because that's what centuries of theological tradition shaped them to believe. But when you go back to the original Hebrew text, when you read the story without layers of later interpretation, an entirely different picture begins to emerge. A picture of a creature that was part of God's creation, brilliant in nature, luminous in appearance, and terrifying in its capacity for choice. This serpent, according to ancient Jewish and early Christian writings, was not a slithering reptile, but a magnificent being, possibly standing upright, capable of walking, perhaps even possessing wings. It was beautiful, radiant, and intelligent, so intelligent that its conversation with Eve sounds less like the hiss of an animal and more like the reasoning of a celestial being accustomed to divine truths. And here is where things begin to shift dramatically. If the serpent was truly just an animal possessed by Satan, why would God punish the animal itself with such specific physical consequences, removing its legs, condemning it to crawl, commanding it to eat dust? Punishments that only make sense if the serpent bore responsibility for its own actions? A host used by Satan would be innocent, yet this serpent is treated as guilty. That inconsistency has puzzled scholars for centuries. But only recently have researchers begun to examine the possibility that the serpent was not a victim of possession at all, but a creature that made its own choice, one that was influenced, yes, but not controlled. A creature whose intelligence and free will were higher than we ever imagined, making it capable of rebellion. But the question that shakes the foundation of traditional theology is this: if the serpent was not Satan, then who was speaking through it? Was the voice entirely its own? Or was there a darker puppet master behind the scenes, manipulating events while staying hidden, never appearing directly so as not to provoke divine confrontation? Some ancient texts suggest that Lucifer himself did not directly enter Eden in physical form. Instead, he influenced a lesser being, one that already occupied a position of trust within the garden. This serpent was not an intruder. It was part of the system, part of the perfection of creation, placed there for a role we no longer fully understand, a role that may have involved guarding the very tree it later tempted Eve to approach. That idea alone adds a layer of betrayal so devastating that it reframes the fall of humanity as something far more tragic: a guardian becoming a corrupter, a protector becoming a predator, a divine creation choosing rebellion within paradise itself. And if that happened once, what does it say about the nature of evil? What does it say about corruption that arises from the inside rather than from an outside invader? Think about the serpent's conversation. This was not the speech of a mindless creature. It discussed theology. It questioned motives. It analyzed divine commands. It predicted consequences. It understood the difference between life and death, obedience and rebellion, divine intention and human desire. There has never been a snake on earth capable of anything close to this. So what was it? The Hebrew word used, nachash, holds the first clue. It does not simply mean snake. Depending on its grammatical form, it can refer to a shining being, a bronze-colored messenger, or one who whispers divine knowledge. The root of the word is associated with brightness, brilliance and revelation. In other words, the serpent of Eden may have been radiant, intelligent, and created with a purpose far greater than crawling in the dust. This understanding appears not just in Hebrew linguistics, but across the entire ancient Near East. Cultures surrounding Israel believed in serpentine beings who served as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Creatures that walked upright, possessed wisdom, and were entrusted with sacred knowledge. If that is the case, then the serpent in Eden fits a pattern seen in many ancient civilizations. But if the serpent was such a being, beautiful rather than repulsive, intelligent rather than instinctive, radiant rather than dark, then its fall represents one of the most catastrophic collapses in history. Because this was not the fall of a demon. This was the fall of a creature made in goodness, designed for purpose, walking in the light yet choosing the darkness. And that choice reverberates through all of creation. It raises haunting questions. How could something made perfect become corrupt? How could a being created to serve turn against its divine designer? And if the serpent could fall inside Eden, a perfect world, what does that say about the fragility of free will? These questions form the foundation of the journey we are about to take together, as we move deeper into this investigation, step by step, layer by layer. You will begin to see that the serpent story is not merely a children's tale of temptation. It is the doorway into understanding the true nature of evil, the origins of rebellion, and the spiritual warfare still unfolding in the unseen world today. The deeper we step into the ancient narrative, the more we begin to realize that the serpent's presence in Eden was not an anomaly, but part of a larger cosmic structure we've forgotten. Eden was not simply a garden. It was a meeting point between realms, a place where heaven and earth intertwined so seamlessly that beings of different natures could coexist without conflict, until one of them chose to break the harmony. And when that harmony was broken, the fracture echoed far beyond what human eyes could see. What most people never notice is that Genesis introduces the serpent with language reserved for beings of higher intellect. It describes the serpent as more cunning than any creature God had made, a phrase that implies a hierarchy of intelligence, not instinct. This was not an accident of language. The writer of Genesis was deliberate. Something about this being stood apart, stood above, stood dangerous. And that danger was rooted not in its body, but in its mind. If this creature was indeed radiant, brilliant, perhaps even winged or upright, then its fall was not simply the result of external corruption, but of an internal decision, a deliberate turn toward rebellion. This radically changes the meaning of Eden's first temptation. Instead of a puppet acting under possession, we may be witnessing the moral collapse of a creature designed for greatness. That collapse is far more terrifying because it mirrors the potential downfall of any being granted freedom. Ancient writings outside the canonical Bible add even more layers to this understanding. They describe the serpent as a guardian placed near the tree of knowledge, entrusted with a responsibility it ultimately betrayed. Imagine a soldier abandoning a sacred post, not because he was forced to, but because something inside him shifted, twisted, hardened. That is the image these texts paint, the first betrayal happening not in heaven, but right inside paradise. This perspective exposes why the serpent's punishment was drastic. It wasn't merely cursed, it was stripped of something glorious. Wings, legs, posture, beauty, radiance, whatever this creature once possessed, was violently taken away. A fall that extreme suggests guilt, personal responsibility, and a level of corruption so profound that God had to reshape its entire existence as a consequence. Punishment only makes sense when guilt is present. The curse to crawl on its belly is more than physical. It symbolizes a descent from glory into humiliation. A being that once stood in light now slinks in dust. A creature created to communicate truth now slithers in silence. It is the image of divine justice acting not on a tool of evil, but on a willing participant. And that truth is far more disturbing than the simple Satan disguising himself narrative most people accept. But the serpent's fall does not end with its physical transformation. The words, "I will put enmity between you and the woman," carry layers of meaning that stretch forward into the entire spiritual history of humanity. This enmity is not just natural hostility between humans and snakes. It is a symbolic representation of the battle between innocence and deception, truth and distortion, creation and corruption. The serpent became the symbol of rebellion, rooted inside creation itself. And the question that arises from this is chilling. If rebellion could emerge inside Eden, how many other beings across the spiritual realm wrestled with similar temptations? How many other created minds hovered between loyalty and pride? How many stories of collapse were lost to time because only the human-centered narrative survived? Eden's serpent may have been the first earthly rebel, but ancient traditions suggest it was not the only one. There are writings from the ancient Near East that describe countless serpentine beings who acted as watchers, guardians, or intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. These beings were feared, honored, and sometimes worshipped because of the knowledge they claimed to possess. The serpent in Genesis fits this archetype precisely. This brings us to a staggering realization. Eden may have been part of a cosmic system shared across multiple ancient civilizations. The serpent's dialogue with Eve becomes even more shocking when analyzed through this lens. It approached her not with the hiss of a beast, but with the persuasion of a theologian. It questioned divine motives. It offered a reinterpretation of God's command. It promised enlightenment. This is not the speech of a reptile. It is the rhetoric of a being who understood the consequences of its words and used that understanding to manipulate innocence. This introduces an uncomfortable truth about evil. It often masquerades not as darkness, but as light. The serpent did not frighten Eve. It intrigued her. It appealed to her desire for understanding. This is the same strategy used throughout all human history. Evil does not always shout, it whispers. It does not always threaten, it offers. And the first whisper in human history came from a creature who once walked in the radiance of Eden. When scholars analyze the serpent's intelligence, they find overwhelming evidence that we are dealing with a being whose consciousness surpassed animal instinct. It reasoned, it persuaded, it debated. These are not qualities of possession alone. They indicate identity. A possessed creature does not become genius overnight. This serpent was already brilliant before any dark influence touched it. This leads us to one of the most unsettling theories presented by early interpreters, that the serpent's fall may have been independent from Lucifer's. It may have chosen rebellion first. Lucifer, recognizing an ally in its fragile pride, may have exploited that internal vulnerability. In that scenario, the serpent is not a victim, it is a collaborator, and collaboration requires willingness. If this interpretation is true, then Eden was not invaded by evil. Eden gave birth to the first earthly rebel. This reframes the entire narrative of the fall. It was not merely the result of external temptation, but the culmination of a creature's internal descent. Eve was deceived by a being who had deceived itself long before she took the fruit. Understanding this transforms the way we view spiritual warfare today. Evil does not always enter our lives through obvious demonic attacks. Sometimes it enters through familiar voices, trusted figures, or subtle whispers that appear harmless. The serpent teaches us that corruption often begins inside the trusted spaces, inside the sacred places, where we least expect it. And as we move forward, the next layers of this mystery will reveal why this serpent was positioned so close to humanity in the first place, the role it may have been assigned before its fall, and the cosmic implications of its rebellion that still ripple through the spiritual realm. As we continue digging deeper into the shadowed layers of this ancient mystery, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Why was the serpent even allowed so close to humanity in the first place? For a being of such intelligence, radiant appearance, and elevated status to stand within reach of the first humans, its presence must have served a specific purpose. Eden was not a place of accidental encounters. Everything in the garden was arranged with intention, from the rivers to the trees to the beings entrusted with specific roles. The serpent's placement was not random, it was strategic. Many ancient traditions suggest that Eden operated like a sacred sanctuary, a meeting point where earthly beings and heavenly messengers could interact in harmony. In such a setting, the serpent may have served as an intermediary, a guide, or even a guardian, whose task was to aid humanity in understanding parts of creation they were not yet prepared to fully comprehend. If this is true, then the serpent's betrayal becomes far more tragic, because it means a being created to help humanity ultimately became the very one that led them astray. What makes this betrayal even more haunting is how familiar the serpent seems with divine boundaries. It understood what God had said. It knew the weight of the command. It recognized the consequences of obedience and disobedience. This suggests that the serpent had some level of access to divine instruction, perhaps even participating in the order and structure of Eden. Its knowledge was not stolen from heaven, it was granted. And that knowledge, once corrupted, became the weapon it used. The moment the serpent spoke to Eve, it did something incredibly subtle, yet incredibly dangerous. It reinterpreted God's words. It didn't deny them outright. It didn't contradict them violently. Instead, it twisted them gently, using a tone that sounded more like curiosity than rebellion. This is one of the most chilling aspects of the entire story. Evil rarely presents itself with obvious malice. It often disguises itself as insight, as clarity, as a new perspective. And that subtle distortion is what shattered paradise. Some scholars propose that the serpent may have grown resentful of the role humanity was destined to play in creation. Humans were created in the image of God, a status no other creature possessed. They were given dominion, authority, and a direct relationship with the Creator that surpassed even the brilliance of celestial beings. If the serpent once held a position of honor, the rise of humanity may have awakened jealousy within it, jealousy that eventually turned into defiance. This perspective adds a psychological dimension to the serpent's rebellion. Instead of a creature acting under the influence of a foreign evil, we might be witnessing a being who felt threatened by the arrival of a new creation, one that carried divine likeness and divine potential. The serpent may have believed it deserved higher authority or deeper closeness to God. And jealousy, once allowed to root itself inside a brilliant mind, can turn light into darkness with terrifying speed. Ancient writings often describe serpentine beings as protectors of sacred knowledge. If Eden contained the tree of knowledge of good and evil, then it would make sense for such a being to be assigned to guard it or oversee it. But what happens when a guardian becomes infatuated with the very knowledge it protects? What happens when the line between duty and desire begins to blur? The serpent may have crossed that line long before Eve approached the tree. There is a growing theory among theologians that the serpent's downfall did not begin with Eve. It began with itself. Long before initiating the conversation with the woman, the serpent may have wrestled with questions similar to the ones it later verbalized. Why should humans be denied knowledge? Why should one tree be forbidden? Why should humans receive divine likeness while other beings remain below them? If these thoughts took root, then the serpent's temptation of Eve becomes an act of ideological rebellion, not mere mischief. This idea transforms the serpent into a tragic figure, an intelligent creation whose internal struggle led it to question the very order it was meant to uphold. When it finally spoke, it wasn't acting on impulse. It was articulating a rebellion that had been brewing internally. Its conversation with Eve was the outward expression of an inward war. And the moment Eve listened, she became part of that war without even knowing it. The serpent's strategy reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of deception. It targeted the human desire for understanding, for growth, for self-discovery. It spoke to the part of Eve that longed for meaning, and that is exactly how deception operates today, through the parts of us that feel incomplete, curious, or overlooked. The serpent's voice wasn't loud or terrifying. It was gentle. That gentleness is what made it deadly. Another detail often overlooked is that the serpent approached Eve alone. This raises an intriguing possibility. The serpent understood that unity between Adam and Eve would make deception difficult. Division, physical or emotional, creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates opportunity. Evil rarely attacks at full strength. It waits for isolation, for moments when we feel unseen, unguarded, or uncertain. Eve's solitude became the serpent's doorway. What is equally disturbing is that Eve did not express fear when the serpent spoke. She engaged with it as though such communication was normal. This supports the idea that the serpent's intelligence and appearance were not frightening but familiar. It may have been a regular presence in the garden, a creature humanity trusted, a being whose insights they perhaps even valued. Betrayal from an enemy is painful, but betrayal from someone trusted is soul-shattering. The serpent's promise, "You will be like God," reveals its deeper intentions. It didn't simply offer knowledge, it offered identity. It appealed to the human desire for elevation, for transcendence, for the very thing it may have craved itself. The serpent's fall and humanity's fall share the same core temptation, the desire to rise above one's assigned place in creation. In that moment, the serpent drew Eve into its own rebellion. From a spiritual perspective, this encounter exposes the danger of questioning divine boundaries with the wrong voice guiding us. Curiosity is not a sin. Desire for understanding is not evil. But when those desires are manipulated by a corrupted mind, they can lead to catastrophic decisions. The serpent used a divine gift, intelligence, and twisted it into a weapon against the very beings it was meant to support. And as this story unfolds, it reveals a universal truth. The greatest dangers to the human soul often come not from external darkness, but from distorted wisdom. The serpent did not promise violence, it promised enlightenment. It presented rebellion as revelation, and that, more than anything else, is why its fall continues to affect humanity across every generation. The next layer of this mystery will take us even deeper into the serpent's original nature, the linguistic evidence hidden within ancient languages, and the staggering implications that arise when we understand what the word nachash truly meant in the eyes of ancient scribes. When we turn to the ancient Hebrew language itself, the mystery surrounding the serpent deepens in ways that modern translations have concealed. The word used in Genesis, nachash, is far more complex than the simple term snake that appears in most English Bibles today. In the worldview of the ancient Israelites, nachash carried layers of meaning, each one pointing to a being that was radiant, intelligent, and capable of communication far beyond the instincts of an animal. To the original readers, the serpent was never an ordinary creature. It was something extraordinary. The roots of the word nachash reveal associations with brightness and shining metal, often linked to the gleam of bronze or polished copper. In ancient Hebrew thought, anything described as shining evoked the image of divine messengers or beings connected to spiritual realms. This would mean that the serpent originally possessed a luminous quality, something visually captivating, perhaps even awe-inspiring. And if Eve encountered a radiant, humanoid-like creature rather than a crawling reptile, her lack of fear suddenly makes perfect sense. But the word nachash carries yet another meaning: to whisper or to enchant, a term often associated with knowledge of mysteries or hidden wisdom. This ties directly into the serpent's behavior in the garden. It did not command Eve forcefully, it whispered. It did not threaten, it persuaded. It embodied the archetype of a being who traffics in secret knowledge, and this raises a profound question. Did the serpent possess access to divine mysteries that humans were not yet ready to receive? Ancient Jewish writings, such as the Book of Enoch and other early commentaries, describe beings that bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual realms. Some of these beings were radiant, serpent-like creatures who carried messages or guarded sacred places. If the serpent in Eden belonged to this category, then its fall becomes even more tragic. A guardian entrusted with sacred knowledge twisted that responsibility into an opportunity for rebellion, turning revelation into temptation. Archaeological discoveries from ancient civilizations that surrounded Israel further support this interpretation. Mesopotamian cylinder seals depict radiant, upright serpentine beings standing in temple courts. Egyptian art portrays serpent deities wearing crowns and bearing symbols of authority. Across cultures, serpentine figures represent wisdom, guardianship, and divine communication, not deception. Only after rebellion does the serpent in the biblical story become associated with corruption and downfall. This reveals a deeper truth. The serpent's original nature was not evil. It was designed with purpose. It carried intelligence, beauty, and authority. But like many beings across the spiritual spectrum, it possessed free will. And free will always carries risk. The serpent's betrayal becomes a mirror of a larger cosmic rebellion, a pattern of creatures choosing self-exaltation over divine alignment. Even the structure of the narrative in Genesis, supports the idea that the serpent was once elevated. The text lists it among the beasts of the field, but then immediately distinguishes it as more cunning than any other creature. This is not a casual description. It is a literary signal that the serpent stands above its category. Something about it was higher, sharper, more aware. It is as though the writer wanted the audience to understand this being is animal in form but far more than animal in mind. The serpent's rhetoric reflects this elevated intelligence. When it speaks, it reveals an understanding of God's nature, human psychology, and the consequences of knowledge. It challenges Eve intellectually, appealing to her curiosity and sense of identity rather than her fears. This method of temptation reveals a being that had observed God, understood spiritual dynamics, and learned to manipulate truths in ways that only a creature with advanced consciousness could. What makes this revelation even more disturbing is that the serpent's brilliance did not vanish after its curse. Its physical form changed, but its symbolic influence continued throughout Scripture and human history. Every deception that promises enlightenment apart from God echoes the original whisper. Every ideology that elevates human desire above divine wisdom mirrors that first temptation. The serpent's legacy is not its body, it is its method. A key detail often overlooked is the serpent's confidence. When it spoke to Eve, there was no tremor, no hesitation. It approached her with the poise of a being who believed it understood more than God had allowed. That confidence hints at a deeper corruption, one born from pride. The serpent may have believed that its brilliance gave it the right to challenge the Creator's command. Pride disguised as enlightenment is one of the most ancient forms of rebellion. This is why understanding the serpent matters today. It reveals that evil rarely presents itself as monstrous. Instead, it often appears enlightened, rational, or even helpful. The serpent didn't tempt Eve with darkness, it tempted her with the illusion of divine elevation. This informs the modern struggle of spiritual warfare. The greatest threats to the human soul are not always the attacks that look evil. They are the voices that appear wise while leading us away from truth. As we analyze the ancient languages further, we discover that serpent-like beings appear across the biblical text in roles of both judgment and guidance. Moses lifted a bronze serpent to heal the Israelites, linking serpentine symbolism to restoration rather than destruction. This demonstrates that serpentine imagery was originally neutral or even positive until the Edenic rebellion corrupted it. That corruption transformed the serpent from symbol of wisdom into embodiment of deceit. The serpent's transformation in Eden mirrors the transformation of many beings throughout Scripture: angels who rebel, prophets who fall, kings who turn to pride. The pattern is clear. Corruption begins when a created being elevates its own perspective above divine wisdom. The serpent was the first to enact this on earth, making it the archetype of internal rebellion. This is why the curse pronounced in Genesis goes beyond physical punishment. "He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel" is more than poetic prophecy. It represents the final conflict between truth and deception, redemption and corruption. The serpent's ultimate defeat symbolizes the victory over every distortion that seeks to separate humanity from the Creator. As we prepare to move deeper, the next block will explore the global mythological parallels, how countless cultures retained memories of radiant serpentine beings, how these stories connect to the biblical narrative, and how the serpent's rebellion fits into a larger cosmic struggle that spans more than the boundaries of Eden. When we look beyond the boundaries of the biblical world and step into the mythological and spiritual memories of ancient civilizations, we discover something astonishing. The figure of the radiant serpentine being is not limited to Eden. Cultures across continents, many with no contact with one another, preserved stories of luminous serpents who acted as guardians, teachers, or intermediaries between gods and humans. This global consistency cannot be ignored. It suggests that humanity carried a shared ancient memory of beings whose nature was neither fully earthly nor fully divine, beings who blurred the line between angelic and terrestrial realms. The Hindu tradition speaks of the nagas, serpent-like entities known for wisdom, supernatural abilities, and a dual nature capable of either protecting or deceiving humans. In Mesoamerican cultures, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, symbolized enlightenment, creation, and divine authority. Norse mythology preserved the image of Jörmungandr, the world serpent whose existence intertwined with cosmic order. While these beings differ culturally, they share an unmistakable pattern: serpentine figures with intelligence, power, and roles connected to divine mysteries. This raises a staggering possibility. Humanity's earliest civilizations may have encountered beings similar in nature to the one described in Eden. These were not ordinary snakes. They were radiant, upright, intelligent, and deeply intertwined with spiritual or cosmic functions. If the memory of such creatures survived through legends and sacred art, then Eden's serpent may have been part of a broader hierarchy of beings recognized across the ancient world. Archaeology reinforces this theory. Temples from Mesopotamia to Egypt contain carvings of serpent beings wearing crowns, holding staffs or standing in postures that indicate authority. These depictions were not meant to frighten, they were meant to honor. The serpent was a symbol of knowledge, healing, and divine communication long before it became an emblem of deception. This means the serpent's fall in Eden did not corrupt merely its body, it corrupted its entire archetype across human consciousness. The serpent's role as guardian also appears in multiple traditions. In Greek mythology, serpent-like beings guarded sacred gardens, divine trees, and heavenly treasures. In Egyptian lore, serpents protected the sun, God's path through the underworld. These patterns support the idea that Eden's serpent may have been a guardian whose original assignment involved overseeing the boundaries of divine knowledge. But when pride entered its heart, the guardian became the corrupter. This shift from guardian to rebel is not unique to Eden. It mirrors the story of heavenly beings across many spiritual traditions: angels who fell from pride, demigods who defied divine order, celestial beings who sought autonomy. The serpent's rebellion is not an isolated event. It is part of a recurring cosmic narrative in which beings endowed with wisdom choose self-exaltation over alignment with divine purpose. When we view the serpent through this global lens, its temptation of Eve gains a much deeper meaning. It was not merely a conversation between a woman and an animal, it was an ideological confrontation. Her fallen guardian offering humanity access to forbidden knowledge before they were spiritually prepared to handle it. Across countless myths, premature access to sacred knowledge leads to catastrophe. The serpent's whisper follows the same pattern. Revelation offered in rebellion becomes destruction. The serpent's method, questioning divine motives, also appears in these global stories. Many traditions describe deceptive beings who present themselves as enlightened, offering secret knowledge with the promise of liberation. Yet their teachings lead to chaos, confusion, or downfall. The serpent in Eden fits this pattern perfectly. It spoke as though it had insight beyond God's restrictions, positioning itself as a liberator rather than a deceiver. This global consistency suggests that the serpent's fall had cosmic implications. Perhaps its rebellion was not confined to the garden. Perhaps its ideology spread through other realms, influencing other beings and leaving traces in myths across continents. If the serpent once held a position of authority in the unseen world, its fall may have echoed across creation, leaving humanity with fractured memories of a once radiant being turned corrupt. And this leads to one of the most profound questions of all. What exactly did the serpent lose when it was cursed? The physical punishment, crawling on its belly, was visible. But what about the spiritual consequences? If the serpent was once radiant, intelligent, and entrusted with sacred duties, then the curse may have stripped it of spiritual access, divine proximity, or cosmic authority. Its fall may have been more severe than anything recorded in Genesis, leaving it as a shadow of its former brilliance. Understanding this also reshapes the meaning of the prophecy given in Genesis 3:15, which speaks of the eventual crushing of the serpent's head. This prophecy is not about defeating a reptile, it is about the final destruction of a being who once stood among the guardians of creation, a being whose rebellion initiated the first ripple of darkness within paradise. That prophecy marks the end of a cosmic conflict that began long before Eve took the fruit. What makes all of this even more remarkable is that the serpent's story parallels humanity's own struggle. Just as the serpent fell from its original purpose, humans also wrestle with the tension between divine calling and personal desire. Just as the serpent questioned God's boundaries, humans often question the wisdom of divine limitations. The serpent's fall becomes a warning, a narrative mirror that reveals the dangers of pursuing knowledge, power, or identity apart from divine alignment. If we understand the serpent as part of a broader spiritual hierarchy, then Eden was not simply a garden, but a battleground, a place where the unseen world touched the physical realm, where loyalty was tested, and where rebellion found its earthly expression. Eden was not the beginning of evil. It was the place where an ancient cosmic conflict burst into human history. The serpent's role in that conflict becomes clearer when we realize that its rebellion was not just against God, but against the destiny God gave humanity. It sought to reshape humanity in its own fallen image, and that pattern persists today. Temptation still comes through distorted wisdom. Deception still disguises itself as enlightenment. Rebellion still presents itself as liberation. The serpent's voice echoes across ages, calling humanity toward the same mistake it made. Understanding these connections prepares us for the final part of this exploration, where the serpent's identity, its fall, and its cosmic implications will connect back to the ultimate promise of victory, revealing why this ancient story still shapes the spiritual landscape of the world today. As we reach the final layers of this ancient mystery, a profound realization begins to emerge. The story of the serpent is not merely a historical account or a mythological echo. It is a blueprint for understanding the nature of spiritual conflict that continues to shape humanity today. The rebellion that began in Eden was not an isolated event. It was the earthly manifestation of a war that started in realms unseen. The serpent's fall was the first fracture within paradise, but it was not the last. Every act of deception that followed throughout history traces its roots back to that initial whisper beneath the branches of the forbidden tree. What makes this more striking is that the serpent's method remains unchanged across millennia. It does not force, threaten, or terrify. It questions. It seeds doubt. It reframes truth in a way that feels logical, even attractive. This subtle approach is what makes spiritual deception so dangerous. People imagine evil as a roaring beast, yet Scripture presents it as a voice offering clarity, enlightenment, and empowerment. The serpent's whisper still moves through ideologies, desires, and distractions that promise elevation while delivering bondage. In understanding this, we begin to grasp why the serpent has become both a symbol and a strategy. It represents not only the being who rebelled, but the pattern through which rebellion spreads. Every distortion of truth, every elevation of pride, every pursuit of knowledge detached from divine wisdom echoes that original deception. And this is why the serpent's identity matters so deeply, because once we understand the nature of the first deceiver, we can recognize its signature in the challenges of our own lives. The prophecy given in Genesis, the crushing of the serpent's head, is therefore not just a poetic image of spiritual victory. It is the promise that deception itself will one day be dismantled. The serpent's head symbolizes its intellect, its brilliance, its capacity to manipulate. Crushing that head means the end of lies, the end of distortion, the end of rebellion masquerading as enlightenment. It is the final reversal of the first whisper that approached humanity with false promises of divine likeness. But before that ultimate victory arrives, humanity continues to live out the tension between truth and deception. Just as Eve faced a choice between trusting divine guidance or embracing the serpent's alternative narrative, each person faces the same crossroads. The serpent's method did not fade into ancient history. It adapted into every era, every generation, every cultural moment. It appears wherever truth is questioned, wherever desire outweighs discernment, wherever self-exaltation overshadows humility. When we recognize this pattern, we begin to understand why the serpent's fall is recorded at the very beginning of Scripture. It is not merely a story, it is the foundation upon which the entire drama of human existence unfolds. The serpent represents the lie that competes with every divine truth. It represents the subtle invitation to redefine boundaries God has already clarified. It represents the dangerous appeal of knowledge divorced from obedience. And yet, amidst this darkness, the narrative also reveals something extraordinary about humanity's value in the eyes of the Creator. The moment humanity fell, God intervened with a promise, not of punishment but of redemption. The serpent is cursed, but humans are covered. The serpent is condemned, but humans are pursued. The serpent is destined for destruction, but humans are destined for restoration. This contrast exposes the depth of divine love, even in the face of rebellion. The serpent's story also teaches us about the danger of proximity to sacred things without the humility required to handle them. The serpent stood closer to divine mysteries than any other earthly creature. It possessed knowledge, brilliance, and access, and yet without humility those gifts became weapons. Humanity often mirrors this struggle. The pursuit of spiritual or intellectual elevation without surrender can lead to the same downfall that transformed the serpent from guardian into corrupter. But there is another side to this revelation. If the serpent's rebellion was rooted in pride and distortion, then humanity's restoration is rooted in humility and alignment. The prophecy of the serpent's defeat points to a future where truth triumphs over deception, not through brilliance or knowledge, but through surrender to divine wisdom. The story of Eden begins with a whisper of rebellion, but it ends with a promise of crushing victory. Throughout history, cultures recreated the serpent in art, myth, and sacred narratives, not because they worshipped snakes, but because they remembered something ancient, something luminous, something terrifyingly intelligent that once walked among humanity. These fragments of memory, scattered across civilizations, point back to a single event, a single being, a single fall that changed the spiritual landscape forever. The serpent became immortal in human consciousness because its rebellion became the archetype of all corruption. And yet, the serpent's end is already written. Its influence may echo through generations, but its destiny is sealed. The prophetic declaration that its head will be crushed is not symbolic comfort, it is cosmic certainty. The same story that began with the serpent's whisper will end with its silence. Deception will not have the final word. Truth will. This brings us to a sobering but empowering realization. Humanity stands between two voices, the divine voice that calls us upward into purpose and the serpent's echo that invites us sideways into distortion. Every spiritual battle, every inner conflict, every moment of temptation is a continuation of the ancient narrative we have been exploring. Eden was the beginning, not the end, of this war. The serpent's identity, once misunderstood as merely Satan in disguise, is far more nuanced and far more relevant to our lives today. It teaches us that rebellion can arise from beauty, that corruption can begin in brilliance, and that deception often comes from sources that appear enlightened. But it also teaches us that no amount of deception can overcome divine purpose. Humanity fell through the serpent's whisper, but humanity rises through the divine promise. And finally, the reason this story has endured across centuries, cultures, and belief systems is because it reveals something universal about the human journey. We all stand in our own Eden, facing our own whispers, walking our own tension between truth and distortion. The serpent's fall is not just a theological concept. It is a reminder that wisdom without humility becomes destruction, but humility aligned with divine truth becomes victory. And in that victory, the ancient prophecy will be fulfilled. The serpent that once walked in radiance will be crushed by the very humanity it once deceived.